Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Ebenezer Reformed Church's online Sunday School class. As we turn back today to 1 Thessalonians, we of course are considering the issue of Paul as an example, as his writing in 1 Thessalonians reveals him as an example to us. But it might be of interest just to bear in mind that the whole question of an example is actually apparent in 1 Thessalonians in multiple ways. For instance, in chapter 1, verse 6, Paul says to the Thessalonians, "And you became followers of us and of the Lord, having received the word in much affliction with joy of the Holy Spirit," now verse 7, "so that you became examples to all in Macedonia and Achaia who believe." In other words, the conversion and the behavior post-conversion of the Thessalonians was such that they could be looked up to as living up to the standard, as providing an example for everybody else. Then, of course, in chapter 2, Paul talks to them a little bit about his own example. And then towards the end of chapter 2, in verse 14, he returns to the idea of somebody providing an example. 1 Thessalonians 2:14, he says, "For you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God which are in Judea in Christ Jesus." So whereas in chapter 1, the Thessalonians were an example to others, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Thessalonians are imitators of the example given by the churches of Judea. And that is maybe a helpful observation to bear in mind, is that when we're following good examples, of course, we become examples ourselves. So we're looking at the Apostle Paul or the other writers of letters in the New Testament as examples, as that's revealed in their letters. Well, if we're able to imitate those things, if we're able to put what we learn from them into practice, then somebody might be able to look at us and see, if you will, a practical exposition, a demonstration of the kinds of things that Paul is encouraging us to, whether directly or by example. But all of that is a little bit by the way, just to highlight that the theme of being an example is present, and is present in more ways than one. In chapter 2, Paul is talking about his own example. He's appealing to the Thessalonians' own knowledge of his behavior among them. He arrived, and his coming was not in vain. It wasn't to no purpose. He arrived in persistence, even though he'd suffered and been treated shamefully in Philippi, yet that didn't deter him. That didn't make him hesitate about communicating the gospel to the Thessalonians. His past sufferings and the potential for more conflict didn't slow Paul down. The reason for that is his belief in the message. It was a message that was worth going through conflict and suffering for. And so we were looking at the example that he provides of integrity. And you see that integrity in several dimensions. Paul, as an evangelist, as a missionary, as an apostle, of course, has a particular commission to communicate the Word of God. And that applies to us then, as we saw, in a couple of ways. One, it applies to us in terms of bearing witness to the truth that we know, bearing witness to what the Lord has done for us. But then, of course, it also applies more generally in terms of telling the truth, even when people don't particularly want to hear it. Paul bore witness to the gospel as part of his calling, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. In other words, the primary audience for the gospel preaching, the king whose message Paul is proclaiming, was God. And so whether it upset people or not, it didn't give him any right to adjust, to massage the content that he had. Now, part of that integrity then, following up on that, was that he didn't use flattering words, and he didn't preach the gospel for his own gain. His preaching was not a cloak for his own covetousness, and he's able to appeal to God to be the witness of that. Another element of his integrity, and I'm going so quickly because we went over these things last week, Another element of his integrity was that he did not seek glory from men, whether from the Thessalonians or from others. In other words, he wasn't preaching to enhance his own prestige, his own reputation, nor was he even deploying his apostolic authority for his own convenience. He says we might have made demands as apostles of Christ, but we didn't. Well, obviously there's a lot in all of that to learn. There's something to learn from the example of integrity. Integrity requires that we focus on God rather than men, that we tell the truth, even if that is upsetting to other people. And so our motivations can't be for gain, whether that's financial or whether that's in terms of our own prestige and standing. Instead, our eye has to be focused on pleasing God. Now, we also saw that that's not contrary to loving the Thessalonians, to loving the people you're preaching to or witnessing to, and desiring the best for them, desiring to help them, because Paul is able to add, but we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. In fact, he was so affectionately longing for them that it would have pleased him to give them not just the gospel, but even his own life, because they had become dear to him. So what we saw from there is that the example of integrity, of pleasing God, is not contrary to the idea of loving people. They ought to go together. If there's a difficulty with holding those two things together, the difficulty is in here. It's with me. It's not with the intrinsic difficulty of honoring God while loving people, or of loving people while honoring God. We might not always have an easy time putting those two things together, but it's not because they're fundamentally opposed. It's because we have a tendency to overbalance or overcorrect or turn friends into enemies. Now, let's pick back up there then in verse 7 for today in terms of the kind of example that Paul is giving us. And if last week we looked primarily at Paul giving us an example of integrity, here, in a sense, we have to look at him as giving us an example of affection, and yet I don't want anybody to even for a second take away the idea that those two things are irreconcilable. They went together in Paul, and they ought to go together in us as well. Now, Paul's affection showed up in his manner, in his approach. He loved them, and that made him gentle. And you know, it's worth pulling that out because, of course, some people can be very gentle, very hesitant, very soft, and yet not necessarily have a whole lot of love. And other people can be very passionately committed, really desire the best for somebody else, and yet not necessarily be very gentle. You can think about it in terms of a doctor. Oftentimes, a doctor comes and speaks to you. It's a stressful, difficult moment, and doctors will get criticized for their lack of bedside manner because they don't show understanding that this is hard for you, because they're not willing to answer your questions, and etc. Well, those things are important. Doctors deal with patients, and patients are human beings, and human beings need to be treated as such. And obviously, if you're talking to the doctor, something is probably not right in your overall environment. So bedside manner is important. But you can imagine a doctor who had a great bedside manner, but then was utterly incompetent when it came to surgery or procedures or prescriptions of any kind. The bedside manner isn't doing you as much good as you would have hoped to receive. Sometimes you get it the other way around. The doctor might be very competent as long as you're anesthetized and immobilized on a table, and that doesn't mean he's got a great bedside manner. Well, the ideal is to be able to hold both together. And I mention that not to criticize doctors, but just by way of illustration, an area that we run into where we hope somebody will be gentle and competent and able to help in a really meaningful way, but also not rude about it. Well, Paul was able to do those two things. He loved the Thessalonians, and that was revealed in his integrity. That was revealed in the way he preached the gospel to them. That was revealed in him not changing or adjusting the truth, but it was also revealed in his manner. He was gentle. He compares himself to a nursing mother with all of the tenderness, all of the softness and care that a woman in that situation will use towards her dearly beloved little child. And Paul compares his gentleness with them to that. Well, there is an example there. There's certainly an example there for ministers, which is that in dealing with believers, gentle where possible, as gentle as possible, gentle out of genuine affection, ought to be something that characterizes us. But then there's also an example for all of us. We sometimes feel that gentleness is going to obscure the message, that gentleness is going to prevent people from hearing the truth, and so forth. Well, that wasn't how it worked with Paul. And if we have integrity, we can be gentle without compromise. And I don't think that we should be aiming for anything short of that. Some of us may do better than others. Some of us may grow more than others in this particular area. But we shouldn't settle for less than that. So Paul has said he's willing to give them his own life because they were dear to him, and that affection he had for them was revealed not only in working for their good, but also in the manner, in the means he used among them. He was very gentle in terms of his interactions. And he illustrates that. He illustrates the willingness to self-sacrifice, the willingness to spare them, to be gentle with them, in verse 9. 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 9. For you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God. What Paul is driving at there is that he supported himself. Now, we know that he had some help from the Philippian church in supporting himself, but he was willing to be self-supporting in order to take away obstacles to the hearing of the gospel. In other words, he was so devoted to the Thessalonians, and others obviously, being able to hear him without suspicions that he has ulterior motives, without the suspicion that he's in it for the money or whatever other thing people might think, that he would prefer to work night and day in order to pay his expenses and yet also have the opportunity and the ability to preach to them the gospel of God. So that's one very concrete illustration of Paul's affection, Paul's integrity, Paul's gentleness, kind of all rolled together then into Paul's diligence or Paul's work ethic. But he goes on to say, you are witnesses and God also. And again, you notice his conscience is comfortable, appealing to God to bear record of his behavior among the Thessalonians. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe. Now, there is an element, again, of integrity, and now it has to do with the uprightness of Paul's conduct. He behaved like a devout person, like a God-fearing person. He behaved justly. He behaved with righteousness. He gave to everyone their due. He behaved blamelessly. Nobody had a legitimate reason to complain about him or accuse him. Now, you might be wondering about this if you remember the history, because after all, there was a certain amount of turmoil surrounding Paul at Thessalonica. There were people who became unhappy with him and accused him of things. He's not saying that it was impossible that anybody should accuse me, because honestly, you never get to that situation. There's always somebody who could say something, as long as they're willing to misinterpret, as long as they're willing to distort or outright lie. But what Paul means is that nobody had a legitimate reason to attack or accuse him. And then he adds another element to this idea of integrity. There was, obviously we've seen the integrity in terms of the content of the message. We've seen the integrity of his love, in his work ethic, in the blamelessness of his behavior. But now he applies that whole idea to his ministry when he says, as you know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God who calls you into his kingdom and glory. And so where Paul has already appealed to his diligence in working to maintain himself, now he also appeals to his consistency, or his thoroughness, if you will, in communicating to the Thessalonians. He communicated to them in more ways than one. He exhorted and comforted and charged. I don't mean to focus on the particulars of how those things differ, but just to point out that Paul addressed them in more ways than one. When they needed encouragement, he gave them encouragement. When they needed comfort, he gave them comfort. When they needed direction, he gave them direction. His ministry, his proclamation of the word wasn't narrow, wasn't constrained, wasn't a paltry diet as though he were feeding them nothing but porridge. He gave them a varied diet. He addressed them in different situations and according to their different needs. And then, in a sense, if you will, there's a final defense of his example of integrity, or a final explanation, because he's not really defending himself. He's not under attack. But there's a final explanation of the integrity of his ministry when he points out the integrity or the holiness of his message. What was he exhorting them, comforting them, admonishing, or charging them to do? He was charging them to walk worthy of God. He was calling them to live up to the calling that God had given them when he called them into his own kingdom and glory. In other words, Paul's message was a message of holiness. So the gospel that he preached was a good word about what God had done for their redemption. Through that gospel, God called them into his kingdom and glory. And now, were they supposed to be worse than they were before? On the contrary, the power of God exercised towards them, the benefit of the message, the outcome of Paul's ministry among them was to be transformed lives. That had already happened to some extent. He recorded it in chapter 1, how they turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven. Their orientation, their belief system changed. Well, of course, their conduct is also supposed to change to be in line with that. And to some extent it did, and to some extent that needed to keep on happening as time went by. And so Paul preached the gospel. He also charged them to walk worthy of God. And so his message is a message of holiness, and that is another part of the integrity of it. Well, when you put all of that together, obviously this is a challenging passage in some ways, because it sort of tells you about the character of a missionary or a minister. What should they be? Well, they should be people of integrity, and that integrity should appear in these various ways. And then, of course, they should also be people of warm affection. But beyond ministers, in terms of how we communicate, Paul tells us that integrity and affection are not at odds. Paul tells us that we should take barriers out of the way. He reminds us a little bit about the content of what we're supposed to be communicating to other people. And he reminds us that it's not an antinomian, it's not a lawless gospel. It's a gospel that encourages walking worthy of God. And so all of those are things that not only ministers, but all Christians can take to heart in one way or another. There's one more point that I'd like to bring out quickly about Paul's narration of his own example here. You notice in verse 7, he says, "We were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children." And then in verse 11, he says, "You know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father does his own children." So there's several interesting things that emerge from that. One is that Paul thinks of both fathers and mothers as loving their children, and yet he describes the characteristic quality of each one a little bit differently. The nursing mother is renowned for her tenderness, whereas the father is renowned for his charging, his comforting, his exhortation of his children. So you can see there that within the average family, there's a little bit of a different role. However, I don't want to overpress that point, because Paul is able to compare himself to both. He has the tenderness of a nursing mother, and he has, if you will, the educational, the character formation interest of a loving father. Children need parents who do both things, and it may well be that one parent is better at one thing than another. But since Paul is able to compare himself to both, we should not think, well, the women will be gentle with this person, or, well, the men will give instruction. More like Paul, we should understand that love appears in a variety of ways. And while we might be stronger in one area than another, our real goal when we approach other people in love is to love them as completely, as roundedly as we possibly can. You also notice that Paul is not embarrassed to compare himself to a nursing mother and to a father as well. He sees, he values, he respects the dignity of those differing parental roles, and he sees an analogy for himself in each one of them. Well, I'd better stop there. This topic might take us a little bit far afield from the question of what kind of an example Paul is in his letters. So we'll leave it there for now, and until next time, may God bless.